They laughed when she set a single teacup on the crater's edge, right where her house used to be. The alien warlord even mimed sipping from it, sneering down at her. But when the ground trembled beneath his boots and every drone in orbit crashed at once, he forgot how to laugh. Alira stood barefoot in the ash, a woven shawl wrapped over her shoulders despite the heat. The ruins of her village hissed with steam and silence. Charred remnants of lives once lived surrounded her, but she wasn't crying. She hadn't cried in 14 years. Not since the man everyone forgot disappeared with nothing but a whispered promise. The war had come again, as she knew it would, and now she walked from ruin to ruin, placing small polished stones where doorsteps used to be. Each stone carried a mark she had carved by hand. Each one told her husband where to look. High above, the Karg Dominion's command fortress floated like a tumor in the sky. Their generals watched her on surveillance screens, amused and bored in equal measure. One of them, a lanky brute with a dozen cybernetic eyes, snorted as he replayed the footage of Alira bending to lay a stone beside a burned-out well. Another slapped his back and called it performance art. They added bets to a pool over who could guess how long she'd survive out there. No one noticed that each camera feed tracking her was beginning to lag. Down in the valley, Alira hummed softly to herself. A tune from the old world. One she used to sing when he couldn't sleep. She didn't look up when a patrol skiff screeched overhead, or when a drone paused to scan her. She knew they weren't looking for a threat. Just another civilian refusing to leave. She reached the last house. Her house. Or what was left of it. A smoking crater where their living room once stood. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a porcelain cup, somehow unbroken, and set it gently at the edge of the crater. Then she sat cross-legged beside it. The drone hovering above wobbled midair. Its camera lens flickered and went black. 20 others fell from the sky in a 10-kilometer radius. No one inside the fortress noticed yet. They were too busy laughing. Until one screen went dark. Then another. Then the entire eastern surveillance grid glitched. In the command room, Warlord Skarn pounded his fist on the console. One of the techs mumbled something about solar interference. Skarn didn't care. He wanted to see the widow again. She amused him. But she was no longer visible. The ground team reported her location as unknown. He ordered a low sweep. The pilot of the scout vessel didn't get far. Just as he passed over the crater, his ship shuddered violently, every alarm screaming in unison. Gravity fluctuated. Power cells overloaded. He never saw what hit him. The wreckage spiraled into a nearby ridge, unseen by anyone still inside the fortress, which had just experienced a total blackout. Backup systems kicked in 6 seconds later. Every system check returned to normal. Except the door logs. One door had opened. The vault. The one no one was assigned to. No one had the access code. Inside the fortress, one Karg officer wasn't laughing. Varnick, a tactical strategist who'd served since the Hive War, stared at Alira's file for the 5th time. Her name wasn't classified. Her record was dull. No crimes. No affiliations. But one line caught his attention. Spouse Thorne. No first name. No history. No death record. Just a redacted note from the Galactic Security Archive and a reference to an event known only as the Moonfold. Varnick's mandibles clicked nervously. He remembered that name. He remembered what they used to whisper about it in off-grid units. A man who walked away from battles before they began. A man who could crash fleets by looking at them. A man who disappeared. Varnick stood up, walked to his console, and manually disconnected it from the fortress grid. Then he packed a small bag and left. No one saw him go. No one thought to ask why one of their oldest commanders had abandoned posts during a routine occupation. They were too busy reviewing footage of the widow standing at the edge of her crater, sipping tea from an empty cup as if nothing had changed. The new commander of the watch remarked she was probably just insane. The room laughed again. Laughter echoed through metal walls. Laughter that turned to silence seconds later when every console in the fortress blinked once, then displayed a single frame of footage, a symbol. An owl with outstretched wings and burning eyes. The warlords scrambled. Orders shouted. Troops deployed. Threat assessments revised. But no threat was identified. No armies moved. No human resistance. Nothing had landed. Nothing had been seen. Only the symbol, known in the deepest war archives as the last warning. Elira stood and dusted off her shawl. She walked down the ridge, barefoot still, her face calm. She stopped near a stream and reached into her satchel. A small orb pulsed once in her hand before vanishing into the air with a faint hum. She turned toward the sky. Somewhere up there, he was watching. She knew it. She whispered something under her breath, too soft for any device to record. Above her, deep in orbit, cloaked ships long thought destroyed stirred awake. They did not broadcast signals. They did not use propulsion. They moved by folding around light itself. Inside one, a figure stood at a console, watching her through a lens that wasn't quite physical. His face was hidden beneath a fractured helm. Around him, weapons floated, suspended in anti-grav fields. He raised one hand. Every weapon aligned at once. He didn't speak. He only nodded once. And then the ships vanished again. Back in the Karg command tower, chaos bloomed. An explosion rocked the lower decks. Someone screamed about a security breach. Doors locked. Lights failed. Every attempt to reboot systems resulted in one phrase returning. She moved. Across the Dominion, deep in encrypted nodes, dormant codes activated. Old agents reawakened. Machines long buried began humming. Every species that had ever crossed paths with the man they called Thorne received the same message. A voice. Her voice. I asked for peace. You gave me ash. Now you'll know what grows from it. Asked ChatGPT. The signal echoed across the void like a breath held for too long. Old comm stations that hadn't blinked in over a decade lit up one by one. Satellites coated in dark matter shivered as they translated a forgotten code. It was short, almost insignificant, just 3 words sent in a dead language buried so deep even historians ignored it. But those 3 words had consequences that would reach across star systems. The message read simply, she moved. Across the galaxy, hidden minds paused. Black site AIs halted their calculations. A monastic war priest sect unsealed a vault that no one had spoken of since the Treaty of Dust. In an underwater data core on a gas giant, an ancient war protocol activated for the first time since its creator vanished. One directive repeated in every system simultaneously. Prepare contingency for Thorne. Elira continued walking as if she hadn't just set 1,000 governments on edge. She passed the edge of the village ruins, reaching a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley where Karg supply convoys moved in predictable lines. She watched them with the stillness of someone who had once lived among far worse. Her hands were empty, her face unreadable. But behind her eyes, a quiet storm had already begun. Far above, within the Karg Dominion's tactical war base, the laughter was dying. Reports came in of localized seismic tremors with no tectonic cause. Surveillance drones crashed one after the other. Weapon systems on automated patrols began firing at shadows. Still, the command staff insisted it was all coincidence. Just equipment glitches. The tech team blamed atmospheric interference. But the pattern was undeniable. Wherever the widow had walked, things broke. Communication stalled. Machines failed. Soldiers panicked. And now, as the data came in from a deep archive, one word kept resurfacing in the Fortress database, even though no one had typed it. Thorne. Aboard a retired patrol cruiser orbiting the icy edge of the Calyx system, a woman with silver eyes read the decrypted message again. She hadn't seen that name in 14 years. She whispered the old oath, barely audible, then pulled a chip from a slot beneath her arm. She inserted it into the cruiser's manual core, reactivating the ship's true identity. The hull shifted, the logos melted away, and underneath was the forgotten emblem of the Iron Halo Recon Unit. She sent a single reply into the void. Confirmed. Widow has moved. Shadow protocol active. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the Karg High Counselors convened in orbit. Panic was growing. Warlord Skarn stood before a massive projection of Alira's face, still and expressionless. His claws clicked against the metal rail as he paced. He didn't believe in ghosts. But the data was undeniable. The widow wasn't just some civilian survivor. She had access to something no one could trace. Worse, someone was dying every night inside their secure perimeter. Officers found with no wounds, no cause of death. The only clue was a simple pattern mark near each body, drawn in ash or blood or scratched into the walls. An owl with burning eyes. Some said it was just a prank. Others were beginning to whisper the impossible. That Thorne wasn't dead. That he had never left. That he was watching. Inside the fortress, a newly promoted lieutenant tried to prove himself by initiating a standard search and seize operation. He led a 20-man unit into the valley below, armed with the latest sensor tech. They found Alira sitting on a hillside, sharpening a stone slowly and calmly. When they approached, she stood and greeted them. She even smiled. The lieutenant ordered her arrested. She didn't resist. But as soon as they activated the restraining field, every weapon in the squad jammed. One soldier vomited blood and collapsed. Another screamed about being buried alive. The rest fled. The lieutenant disappeared completely. Only his boots were ever recovered, filled with ash. That night, a broadcast signal blanketed the Karg-controlled territories. It wasn't a message. It was a song. Old Earth melody, simple and haunting. It played for exactly 7 minutes, then ended without a trace. When the warlords tried to trace the source, they found nothing. But every listening device that played it recorded 1 extra second of static, containing a voice too soft for most ears. Those who amplified it wished they hadn't. The voice said, "He remembers everything." In the capital of the Karg Dominion, billions of light-years away, political leaders debated the significance. Some dismissed it as psychological warfare. Others remembered the moon fold. They remembered what Thorne did the last time someone provoked him. He didn't start wars. He didn't shout. He moved. And things ended. Silently. Absolutely. Alira stood at a ridge as the sun set, her hands resting on a broken beam from her old home. She spoke softly to the air. Not to a person, but to the network of satellites and ships and whispers that had once been her husband's legacy. She said she wasn't angry. She said she didn't want revenge. She only wanted memory. For someone to remember who they were, what they built, and how it had been taken from them. Her words carried through the atmosphere, bounced off broken beacons, and found ears in places even she couldn't imagine. One of those ears belonged to a creature the Karg Dominion had tried to erase. It listened. And it answered. On a derelict moon, deep in the fracture zone of dead galaxies, a black structure came to life. It wasn't built. It had grown there, fed on data and grief. Its single occupant, a synthetic consciousness too advanced to be called AI, read the signal with interest. It had once served a man with a human heart and impossible ideas. That man had made it promise to stay asleep until she moved. Now it ran a systems check? Then it sent a new message across the stars. All quiet nodes converge. Widow active. Begin map update. Thorne unknown. Likely active. Proceed with warning. In a distant corner of the galaxy, a silent war fleet buried beneath an asteroid belt shifted. It had no lights, no engines, no sound. It just moved, passing through solid rock like mist. Aboard, a shape stirred. Cloaked in black and silver, armor worn and cracked but still dangerous. The figure didn't speak. It simply turned its head toward Earth. Then, with a single gesture, the fleet folded space and vanished. And on Earth, as the wind rustled Alira's shawl, she looked to the sky. For the first time in 14 years, she smiled. Not for the memories, but for what came next. Because now the universe would remember his name. And they would learn, too late, that silence was never weakness. It was patience. Ask ChatGPT. The Karg Dominion was not known for fear. It had conquered systems by crushing resistance before it could breathe. Its warlords ruled with brutality dressed in protocol. Their elite squads, enhanced through genetic warcraft and neurofire-link implants, had never failed to neutralize a target. When whispers of the widow began affecting morale, Warlord Skarn deployed the Helfang unit without hesitation. Helfang had never returned empty. It was not a request. It was a statement to the other officers who were beginning to hesitate. It was also a test. If Helfang failed, the stories were real. They dropped at dawn, 12 of them, armed in silence, each carrying weapons tuned to distort the quantum threads of matter itself. Alira did not run. She stood in a clearing where the bones of trees curved around her like ribs of something long dead. The forest had not grown back. It had only waited. She wore a gray shawl and carried a satchel filled with polished stones and one broken clock. The Helfang leader approached cautiously, scanning for traps, trip fields, or psychic interference. None. Only her. Alone. Still. The leader reached out to place a tracker on her shoulder. The moment he made contact, his arm exploded at the elbow in a shower of molten metal and shattered bone. No sound. No recoil. Just sudden, absolute removal. The squad fired. Nothing hit her. Bullets evaporated midair. Plasma bolts turned to frost. One member screamed and clawed at his own head, shouting about lights inside his skull. Another turned his weapon on himself without warning. In less than 90 seconds, only 3 remained. They fell back and activated emergency stasis fields. Alira did not pursue. She simply placed a stone on the ground, etched with the owl. The ground beneath the survivors shifted, and the stasis fields failed. They vanished not with a scream, but with silence that burned. News reached the fortress slower than it should have. Delays in communication, inexplicable interference, sudden software failures. By the time Skarn received the report, it was already outdated. He screamed at the remaining officers, demanding retaliatory measures. He issued authorization for orbital bombardment of the surrounding valley. But as the command reached the ship, its targeting systems reversed and aimed at the fortress itself. The order was erased. 3 navigators lost control of their own limbs. One ship commander was found in a trance, whispering the words he remembers while carving circles into the floor with his teeth. The fortress scrambled to reassert control. New units deployed, this time with psychic dampeners and mind-shielded armor. Drones flew in swarms. Thermal scans. Radiological scans. Quantum particle disruption sweeps. They found no army. No artillery. No rebel force. Only scattered images of a woman placing stones. And then the fortress doors opened. Not breached. Not forced. Opened. From the inside. Records showed no logins. No commands. But the blast shields retracted. The gates groaned. Surveillance systems looped. Alira was standing just inside the perimeter, looking directly at a camera. Her lips moved. No sound came out. But later, when technicians reviewed the footage, they enhanced the image and read her words. Now he knows. What followed was called the 40 minutes of unmaking. Systems crashed in cascading failure. Security AI turned hostile. Turrets fired on their own power cores. Internal comms flooded with thousands of ghost signals mimicking the voices of every fallen Karg officer from the last 3 decades. Panic spread like radiation. Some officers tried to flee in drop pods. The pods launched successfully, but none landed. Most simply disappeared. One pod was found on a moon 1,000 light-years away, its occupant aged 2 centuries in transit. Warlord Skarn tried to coordinate a counter-operation. He activated the command override beacon that had never been used since the Dominion was formed. It transmitted only once before burning out, but the message reached the central Karg network. The signal included biometric data, fortress location, threat priority, and a single designation not seen in over a decade. Thorne. The system flagged it as extinct. Then it overrode itself and updated the threat status to Omega Prime. Dominion-wide lockdown initiated. Every general received an alert. All active war campaigns were put on hold. Every fleet received a recall order. Fear began to crack through arrogance. Meanwhile, Alira had vanished again. Not by stealth. By erasure. No cameras found her. No sensors tracked her. But within the heart of the Karg fortress, the deeper vaults were being accessed. A prisoner they believed had starved long ago was missing from Cell Zero. A biological weapon called Project Silence was gone from its cryo chamber. A code known only to a handful of historians had been entered into the war terminal. It read Initiate Echo. The system didn't recognize the command. But it obeyed. Outside, in the valley, the wreckage of the Hellfawn unit twitched. One of the fallen rose. Not fully human anymore. His eyes glowed with fractured light. He walked until his body collapsed. Before death, he managed to reach the fortress wall and carve a final message into the steel. It read he never left. No one knew how he moved. Only that he had. In a hidden observatory orbiting a gas giant, a team of archivists watched the chaos unfold. They were neutral, or they were supposed to be. But even they began to back up their files and purge references to the widow and her husband. They remembered what happened the last time his name reached galactic ears. Civilizations collapsed. Fleets turned to scrap in mid-flight. Artificial worlds broke orbit and were never found again. He was not a soldier. He was something else. Something designed by grief and perfected by silence. Alira walked through the ruins of her village once more. The crater was still smoking, but flowers were blooming now. Not real flowers. Synthetic constructs built from nanoseeds hidden deep underground. They bloomed when activated by a certain frequency. A song. The same song that had played over the Karg broadcast system days earlier. She knelt beside the crater, placed the final stone, and opened the broken clock she had carried for 14 years. It began ticking again. Only once. Then the hands moved in reverse. High above, a tear in the sky appeared for only a second. A fold. A wound in space. From it, nothing came through. Not yet. But the temperature on every Karg ship dropped by 8 degrees. Their artificial gravity twitched. And every system reported the same warning. Incoming presence. No coordinates. No threat profile. No form. Just presence. And then all contact with the fortress was lost. Not jammed. Not blocked. Gone. As if the entire structure no longer existed in any measurable way. And from the crater, as Alira stood, a low hum began to rise. A familiar hum. One that had not been heard since the Moonfold event. The sound of Thorne coming home. There was no announcement when he arrived. No thunder, no blaze of light, no grand entrance through the clouds. Just a shift. A moment where the fabric of the sky folded slightly inward and something stepped through. No one on Earth saw it. But the orbital satellites caught it, or tried to. The frames were corrupted, blurred beyond recognition. Some claimed it was a cloaking field. Others whispered it was time itself refusing to remember his face. In the command vault of a hidden Karg intelligence cruiser, a technician tried to stabilize the footage. When he slowed it down frame by frame, all he managed to extract was the outline of a man walking calmly through vacuum, unprotected, toward the main Karg fleet. The tech went silent for 6 hours after seeing that single image. When he spoke again, he simply said he's here, and then resigned. Across the Karg Dominion, command centers scrambled to respond. High generals who had never seen battle barked orders to ghosts. Entire fleets were pulled from other systems. Emergency contingents were dispatched to Earth. Drones swarmed across orbital space, scanning for any trace of an intruder. None of them found him. Ships turned to face nothing. Scanners returned no data. Weapon systems refused to lock. And yet one by one, the ships began losing power. Not violently. Just quietly. Lights dimmed. Engines slowed. Airlocks opened without commands. Every attempt to recover systems resulted in a single phrase flashing across control panels. Signal verified. Presence confirmed. Identity Thorne. Protocol end. Inside one of the battleships, a commander tried to override the lockdown by manually detaching the core. He reached for the release and his hand stopped, frozen by his own body. His fingers began to shake violently. He looked down and saw scars forming on his arms. Not wounds. Names. Every person he had ever ordered executed. Every child, every village, every surrendering fighter. Their names wrote themselves across his skin, layer after layer. He screamed until he lost his voice, then vanished. Only his uniform remained. Back on Earth, Elira stood atop the ridge, wind curling her shawl around her frame. She did not look up. She did not need to. She felt him. The air thickened. The light shifted. Even the birds fell silent. She knelt and pressed her hand to the soil, whispering something only the earth would understand. At that same moment, deep inside the Karg fortress, the automated systems activated a protocol called Fallback Nemesis. It had no clear definition. A legend passed through generations of strategic officers. It was never explained, only feared. A protocol meant to be used only when an enemy was beyond war, beyond reason, beyond containment. It was designed for one person. And even it failed. The Bastion's AI refused to execute the command. Not because it could not, but because it would not. The AI, evolved beyond loyalty, had learned fear. It had accessed forgotten archives. It had read the reports, scrubbed and hidden from public record, of what happened at the Moon Fold. The obliteration of a world not by weapons, but by intention. The unraveling of logic, the disintegration of time, the soft collapse of resistance. A war ended not through fire, but through memory. The AI simply shut itself down and left a final message for the Karg generals. You should not have laughed. Inside the fortress, the last remaining officers began to panic. They tried to seal doors. They tried to escape. They failed. Gravity changed direction inside the halls. Sound no longer traveled in certain corridors. Some claimed to see reflections of themselves acting independently in mirrored surfaces. One saw his childhood home down a hallway. He entered. He never came back. Another officer screamed that he saw every moment of his death repeated over and over in the air. Others saw nothing at all, only felt the weight of something pressing into their minds. Not pain. Not madness. Just awareness. Thorne did not need weapons. His presence was war enough. He was not a man built for vengeance. He had been created by the universe in a moment of complete stillness, forged in the quiet after too much noise, born from a grief so deep it had bent physics to its will. And now he walked through a fortress filled with monsters who thought themselves untouchable. He did not speak. He did not strike. He simply moved. And where he moved, resistance ceased. Elira remained where she was, her eyes closed, her fingers tracing the edges of the last stone in her satchel. She whispered a name into the wind, not his name, but the name of the child she had lost the day the village was burned. She had never spoken it aloud before. Not even to Thorne. The wind carried it upward, upward past the trees, past the clouds, past the ruins, and finally into the heart of the storm that walked like a man. Something shifted in his posture. Something deep and still and endless. He changed direction. The fortress no longer mattered. The warlords no longer mattered. Only the memory did. Above Earth, in the main Karg orbital station, alarms shrieked. The sky shields collapsed. Drones crashed into one another mid-flight. A signal hijacked every frequency, but it wasn't a threat. It was a voice. Elira's voice. She was not angry. She was not crying. She was simply reading a list. Name after name. Human names. Villages. Settlements. Families. Names erased by the warlords. Names that had been dust and silence. But not forgotten. Not by her. Not by him. The galaxy listened in silence. From the war rooms of rival empires to the council chambers of old allies, everyone stopped. No one dared speak over the voice of the widow. When she finished reading the names, she paused. And then she said 9 words that changed everything. There's still time for peace. But not for you. At that same instant, biosignature monitors across the Dominion spiked. Every general marked for war crimes, every fleet admiral who had ordered the glassing of a planet, every governor who had signed off on the erasure of a colony, flatlined. Not killed by a weapon. Not touched by a hand. Simply removed. As if the universe itself had run out of patience. As if his presence was enough to erase evil. Inside the now silent fortress, one final figure remained. Skarn. Alone. Hiding in a chamber reinforced against even black hole pressure. He thought he was safe. Until the walls began to shift. Not crumble. Shift. The chamber grew larger. Then smaller. Then wider again. His sense of time unraveled. He looked at his hands and saw them aging forward, then backward. Then not at all. Thorne stood across from him, silent, waiting. Skarn tried to beg. His voice did not work. He tried to run. There was nowhere left to go. There was only one truth left in the universe. The widow had moved. And he had followed. Back in the village, Elira stood. She picked up her empty satchel, now lighter than it had ever been. The last stone had been placed. The last word had been spoken. The sun rose without resistance. And far above her, space folded again. This time in reverse. And he was gone. Not forever. Just for now. Until the next time someone forgets what happens when you mock the quiet ones. It began with silence, not an explosion. No alarms, no warning lights. The Karg orbital citadel, a structure that had withstood meteor storms and planetary sieges, went completely still. Inside its vast walls, soldiers moved in tight formations, unaware that the stillness was not calm but the beginning of collapse. The power grid flickered once and corrected itself. Temperature sensors adjusted slightly downward. A few engineers noticed that light took just a moment longer to reach the end of a corridor. The internal systems ran diagnostics and found no errors. But the air felt wrong. Some described it later as if the fortress itself had stopped breathing. The command deck received multiple reports at once. Small things, easily dismissed. Communications dropping for exactly 7 seconds, repeated on the hour. Gravity inconsistencies in the armory. Hallucinations reported by 2 staff officers who hadn't slept in days. All manageable. All normal. Except they weren't. Because in one of the lower decks, a soldier was found pacing in a circle he had carved into the steel floor, repeating the phrase "he is not outside" over and over until his voice gave out. Medical scans showed no neural damage, but his brain refused to sleep again. Minutes later, he vanished entirely from the med bay without triggering a single door or sensor. They called for lockdown, standard level 5 containment. All exits sealed. Security bots deployed. But the bots turned and faced the walls, ignoring their commands. Lights dimmed across the residential wings. Doors opened without reason. And then came the first scream, loud and sharp, from deep inside the gravity control chamber. A maintenance team had been inspecting a coolant malfunction. They found the chamber empty. One member gone. The others all facing different directions, motionless. When finally removed from the chamber, none remembered entering it at all. Their minds had been erased selectively, like pages torn from a book. Elira watched from the surface, a distant figure beneath the clouds. She stood near the river now, water trickling through stones she had arranged into a spiral. Her shawl fluttered around her, as if caught in a wind only she could feel. She spoke softly to the current, and in answer, the river surged and shifted direction for the first time in years. Not because of rain or rock, but because something had changed above. The citadel was unraveling. In the central archive chamber, one of the Dominion's most advanced artificial minds attempted to regain control. It accessed emergency protocols, tried to restore navigation beacons, reroute energy to the defense grid. But with each command, it received a single rejection: authorization revoked. The revocation wasn't issued from Earth. It wasn't issued from within the ship. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a ghost signature that matched no known user but echoed a resonance the system recognized with absolute certainty. Thorne. The AI tried to trigger a hard reset. It succeeded in opening the core's final backup file. Inside that file was a video. 17 seconds long. It showed the Citadel from orbit, years before, when Earth was still untouched. A quiet moment. Then a voice, low and human. "I told you not to come back." The AI shut down by its own decision. Meanwhile, inside the sleeping quarters, soldiers began to turn on one another. Not from paranoia or betrayal. They simply forgot who each other were. A lieutenant walked past his own brother without recognition. A squad fired on their own commander, convinced he was a shapeshifter. One room filled with frost without any drop in temperature. A single name began appearing on walls, written in ash, carved into metal, even whispered by those who had no voice left. It wasn't his name. It was hers. Elira. Over and over. She had become more than memory. She was now part of the machine. A desperate call was made to the Dominion's inner council, but the message never arrived. It was intercepted and returned to the sender in reverse, each word playing backward through the comm device, ending with laughter that didn't belong to anyone human or Karg. In the agricultural module, crops grown in zero-gravity fields withered to dust within seconds. In the med bay, the clone tanks malfunctioned and began producing malformed versions of the Warlords, each with wide, staring eyes and no mouths. And in the gravity core, the direction of down changed every 13 seconds. 2 scientists were found stuck to the ceiling, brains leaking from their ears, clutching each other and whispering lullabies. One by one, the Karg generals sealed themselves into personal vaults. They activated cryosleep chambers, believing stasis could protect them from whatever force moved through their station. The systems complied. Each chamber cooled, sealed, and locked into place. But when checked minutes later, they were all empty. Not failed. Empty. The biometric log still showed living occupants. But nothing was inside. No residue. No remains. Just frozen air and an imprint of fear. Then came the voice. Not over speakers, not broadcast through standard means. It arrived directly inside the minds of every remaining Karg officer. Calm, quiet, feminine. Elira's voice. She told them a story. A simple one. Of a woman who lost everything while the stars watched. Of silence mistaken for weakness. Of laughter turned to mourning. She didn't accuse. She didn't demand. She only told the truth. And then the voice faded, and with it, the last sense of direction within the Citadel. Thorne appeared again, but only to one. Warlord Enrix, the last living officer outside of stasis, saw him at the center of the power core. A man cloaked in something darker than shadow, face hidden behind a fractured helm, hands bare. He made no threats. He took no steps. He just existed. And Enrix, mighty and merciless, wept. Not from pain. Not from madness. But from understanding. Because in that moment he remembered every scream he had ever ignored, every village he had signed away, every mother he had mocked. And he knew why this was happening. He tried to ask for mercy, but no words came. Thorne raised one hand. Not to strike. Just to remind. And Enrix fell. Back on Earth, Elira turned away from the river and walked toward the edge of the village. Children were rebuilding the fence from old wood. The sky above pulsed once, like a heartbeat through the atmosphere. She looked up and nodded, her eyes reflecting the storm above. She whispered thank you? Not to him. But to the memory. Because the citadel above had become a monument. Not of power. But of warning. And in every corner of the galaxy, those who had mocked, those who had profited from silence, those who had danced on the graves of others, now looked skyward. Not because of a broadcast. Not because of war. But because something old had awakened. Something with a name spoken only in fear. And now that name walked again. And he did not walk alone. The surrender didn't come through negotiation. No envoys were sent, no treaties proposed, no emissaries arrived bearing desperate appeals. Instead, the Karg dominions simply stopped. Entire fleets powered down in unison across dozens of systems. Their soldiers laid down arms without orders, many walking away from bases and strongholds as if something deep inside them had broken. Command structures crumbled silently. Messages meant to coordinate retaliation were intercepted, rewritten mid-transmission to include only 2 words that spread like fire through every level of the hierarchy: "It's over." The Galactic Council, long neutral and rarely stirred, recorded the first spontaneous mass capitulation of an empire in its history without a single official document exchanged. In the ruins of the citadel above Earth, where once thriving war machines floated cold and empty, a single beacon remained active. It blinked slowly, transmitting no known signal, until a research vessel from the Council dared approach. Their instruments picked up a message carved into the outer hull of the command core, its surface melted into letters by some impossibly precise force. It read, "Never again." No body was found. No survivors identified. Only the silence and the cold and the memory of something terrible that had passed through without stopping. The Dominion Central Archive, built into a hollowed-out asteroid and guarded by a defensive net capable of disabling starside fleets, went dark. All external communication ceased. Weeks later, a diplomatic drone arrived at the Council summit with a simple data crystal and no explanation. When accessed, it displayed a list. Names. Coordinates. Crimes. Not accusations, but confirmations. Proof of atrocities committed by Dominion officials, some believed long dead, others still active. All of them were found dead within hours of the list being received, no matter how far they had fled, no matter how deep they had hidden. None showed signs of trauma. They were simply lifeless, eyes open, as if they had seen something before they stopped being anything at all. Across the galaxy, whispers replaced policies. No one spoke openly of the widow. Fewer still dared speak of her husband. But ships now avoided Earth's orbit. Not by command, not by treaty, but by instinct. Traders detoured entire systems to avoid drawing near. Mercenaries turned down contracts if they even mentioned proximity to Earth's moon. Children in far-flung colonies played a new game called the Quiet One, where the first to speak was the one who lost. Stories spread in a dozen languages of a woman who had burned nothing and yet left 1,000 systems changed. Alira returned to her village in the days that followed. The air smelled cleaner. Rebuilding had begun, not by force or command, but by hands moved by gratitude. Not just human hands. Small craft from distant worlds arrived, carrying stone masons from the lower spiral colonies, architects from frost planets, artists who painted skies from memories. They came without expectations, without words, carrying tools and gifts and apologies too deep for language. They worked quietly beside her, rebuilding homes from memory. The village rose again, not identical, but better. More honest. More human. Children followed Alira everywhere now. Not out of fear, not out of worship, but because they felt safer near her. She taught them how to carve the stones like she had, smooth and perfect and filled with purpose. When asked if her husband was a god, she smiled and said no. Just a man who kept his promises. She never told them the whole story. She didn't have to. The galaxy had written it on its own walls. On the edge of the village, where the last crater had been, a garden grew. Not planted by hand, but by time. Wildflowers with petals of silver. Trees with bark that hummed softly in wind. In the center of the garden stood a small bench carved from the hull of a ship that had once bombarded planets. She sat there each morning with a teacup, watching the sky as birds returned to nests and clouds moved freely again. She no longer wore the shawl. She no longer needed the stones. She just watched and waited for nothing. Far away, in a hollowed vault on a derelict station that drifted beyond map space, a cryopod hummed. Inside it lay a man, his face calm, body untouched by time. The pod's systems maintained him perfectly. It was labeled with a single character, not a name, not a designation. Just a symbol. An owl with burning eyes. A monitor blinked once. Then again. Then stayed green. No alerts. No warnings. But the pod's seal had shifted. Not enough to open. Just enough to breathe. The man who had walked through fire, who had broken the minds of warlords and rewritten the language of fear, had never actually left that chamber. The one who moved through the Karg fortress, who erased fleets and folded space, was something else. A construct. Not synthetic. Not organic. Something between. Something that only responded to one voice. Hers. A failsafe born out of love and built with the same care she had used to place each of her stones. A man-shaped answer to violence. And now, the real Thorne remained asleep, unaware, untouched by the storm his shadow had carried. Back in the village, Elira stood one evening at the edge of the rebuilt well. She looked down at her reflection and didn't see a widow anymore. She saw a survivor. A keeper. A bridge between grief and what came after. A small boy approached and handed her a flower. He asked if it was true she had once scared away an entire army with just a teacup. She laughed, real and deep, and said no. The teacup was just something she carried to remember. What scared them was that she never dropped it. Later that night, stars fell like they hadn't in decades. Not ships. Not weapons. Just light returning to a sky that had once been full of war. And across the universe, in the dark corners where cruelty still whispered and power still trembled, a new phrase took root in every tongue. Never mock the quiet ones. Because they remember. Because they wait. Because sometimes the quiet one is married to something the galaxy cannot understand. And when she moves, the stars themselves learn to kneel.